HMS Erebus, as the other Royal Navy monitors from the First World War, was an odd-looking ship with its large guns and bare decks. Erebus and her sister Terror came about after the poor performance of the first of the 15-inch monitors, Marshal Ney, as their machinery was rather poor. Erebus, a better designed monitor armed with 15-inch guns, entered service with the Royal Navy in early September 1916, going on to participate in the bombardment of Ostend and Zeebrugge in January 1917. Later that year, Erebus was damaged by a German remote-controlled boat, where she was relatively unharmed thanks to her rather large torpedo bulges. Following the war, she participated in British operations in the Russian Civil War, both in the White and Baltic Seas. In between wars, she did trial firing against captured German ships, namely HMS Baden, and was a turret drill ship. During the Second World War, she fought across the world, from the Mediterranean theater to the Indian Ocean, and of course as part of the bombardment force at D-Day. Due to her First World War vintage, Erebus would have repairs and upgrades throughout her career. Still, after 2 world wars and various bombardment missions, Erebus was a worn-out ship, eventually scrapped in 1947. I won't bore you with the background for the Royal Navy monitors. For that, I'd watch my video on weird and wacky warships, or anything in the monitors playlist. Anyway, our story with Erebus begins in mid-May 1915, as the Army was not pleased with the Royal Navy's decision to bring home the battleship Queen Elizabeth from the Dardanelles, which underlined the importance the battleship's guns had for the bombardment, specifically her 15-inch guns. It was hoped that the newly commissioned monitor, Marshal Ney, would be sent to the Dardanelles in the battleship's place. Beforehand, though, there were plans for 4 further 15-inch monitors propelled by steam to be produced at a rapid rate. So much so, there was some thought into transferring the mountings from the battleship Royal Oak and delaying her completion until 1917. The Admiralty was not too excited about the prospect of that battleship's completion being delayed, so because the speedy completion of those monitors depended on getting Royal Oak's turrets, the monitors were cancelled instead. Another blow to the monitor program came with the disappointing news of Marshal Ney's machinery trials, and to quote Drakhinifel, Marshal Ney's engines were about as reliable as a politician's promise. The Admiralty thought there was a better way to use the valuable guns of the 2 marshals. Marshal Soult ended up keeping her guns as she performed better, but Marshal Ney's guns were transferred to the future Terror, and Marshal Ney was armed with 9.2-inch guns. This brings us to the Admiralty's bright idea. They were going to design and build 2 new monitors and transfer the guns to the new ships. Where to quote Ian Buxton in Big Gun Monitors, Design, Construction, and Operations 1914 to 1945, the new design was particularly significant as it was the only one during World War I which incorporated from the keel up any feedback or experience from completed ships, the normal process of evolution in naval architecture. The overriding consideration was the need to achieve the specified 10 knots and, if possible, to get 12 knots. By September 16th, Frode had sent to London the first results of the new model tests, showing that about 1,800 effective horsepower was necessary for 12 knots. Lillicrap was instructed to use a propulsive coefficient no higher than 0.3, so it was estimated that about 6,000 indicated horsepower would be required, over double the power of the previous vessels. With that being said, there would be changes to the hull. The new class was going to be considerably longer, and this was necessary to obtain a relatively fine entrance and run. The angle of entrance at the waterline was reduced to about 50 degrees compared to the 120 degrees in the earlier monitors. With these finer lines, it would give better flow of water aft and thus improve propulsion efficiency, along with steering, something that would be an issue in later years for Erebus. The width of the ship was kept the same as the Marshal's, but the torpedo bulge was reduced. Interestingly enough, the new monitors would be getting a new type of bulge, where again taking from Buxton, experiments with new forms of bulge construction for battleships had been carried out during 1915 using models, following up with a full-scale section of a part of the side of a ship 80 feet long and 31 feet 6 inches wide and deep, called the Chatham Float. As a result, the bulge consisted of an outer and inner watertight compartment, the outer being empty, and the inner, instead of being open to the sea, was filled with steel tubes sealed at their ends. The idea was that much of the explosion's force would be dissipated in crushing the tubes. Thus, the new monitors had a bulge only 13 feet wide, an airspace of 9 feet, and a tube space of 4 feet, filled with about 70 tubes of 9-inch diameter lying fore and aft in each bulge compartment. Inboard, 1.5 inches of high tensile steel protected the hull proper. The more powerful engines with 4 boilers in place of the usual 2 required a machinery space 82 feet long. Using oil fuel instead of coal simplified the layout of the bunker spaces as well as reducing the number of stokers. The monitors were also going to get a proper bridge and funnel, making them look considerably more like ships as compared to the rather stark appearance of the earlier 14-inch and 12-inch monitors. Reginald Bacon, in charge of the Dover patrol with the monitors, came to the designers with some ideas. He suggested the guns be given an increased elevation to 30 degrees, resulting in an extra 6,000 yards of range. There were some other minor changes as compared to the other monitors, but they are really not that interesting. The orders for the ships were placed on September 29, 1915, and to help speed up the process, the materials for the cancelled monitors, which had been ordered, were used. Also, good news for the government, it helped cut costs. While under construction, the 2 new 15-inch monitors were given names, HMS Terror and HMS Erebus. Gone were the generals, and in came the previous bomb ships, some of which had some rather interesting fates. Completion of the ships in 6 months was specified. This became increasingly difficult with the shortage of labor and the larger, more complex designs, so the short period was not realistic. Complicating the construction even more for Erebus was the fact that Marshal Soult's machinery was acceptable and therefore her turret was no longer available. Where again to take from Buxton. Therefore, it was necessary to hurry on for Erebus, one of the 2 turrets ordered as spares for Furious should her 18-inch prove unsatisfactory. As H&W did not have a large enough crane, Erebus was towed to John Brown's at Clydebank on July 13th for her turret to be erected. It seems I can't manage to get away from Furious in these videos. No official displacement figures of displacement as completed were recorded, although the ship's draft suggests that it was about 8,450 tons in deep condition. Due to Erebus's extended time being constructed, she got a few upgrades as compared to Terror, who had left Belfast on August 6, 1916 to join the other monitors in Dover. Erebus had 2 quick-firing 6-inch guns mounted abreast the funnel on the forecastle deck to augment the 12-pounders. Erebus joined the Dover Patrol in September 1916. On their trials, the 2 monitors achieved their goals for their machinery, and then some, with Erebus cruising at a top speed of 14.1 knots. A stately speed that was much improved over the previous monitors. Erebus arrived at Dover on September 5th just in time to support General Haig's offensive, this being the Battle of the Somme. Haig asked Bacon to bring the monitors to the coast to draw German forces there, in which Erebus and Terror were out for several days with the other monitors to bombard German positions in and around Zeebrugge. The effect on the German troop deployments was probably minimal, according to monitors of the Royal Navy, how the fleet brought the great guns to bear by Jim Crosley. And to quote Crosley, "The winter of 1916/1917 was extremely cold, making it impossible for the German destroyers to use the Zeebrugge to Bruges Canal. They therefore had to lie alongside the mole at Zeebrugge. Bacon was determined to catch them napping there during a spell of especially bad weather and set off with the Erebus and Terror. The ships had a miserable voyage to a rendezvous off Dunkirk, but the snow got thicker and the weather worse, so the promising venture had to be abandoned for lack of visibility." Due to that poor weather, the early months of 1917 weren't that exciting, with each of the 15-inch monitors taking station as guard ships at night. Although there were several raids in the vicinity, they never had a proper chance to fire their main guns, but such powerful defenses did have a deterrent effect. While unable to use his monitors due to the poor weather, Bacon decided that he was going to make a determined effort to use the 3 15-inch monitors and whichever of the 12-inch monitors was available to do damage to the port facilities at Ostend and the lock gates at Zeebrugge. A small convoy of the monitors and other small ships set out for the Belgian coast in early May, which the operation finally took place on May 12th, with Crosley writing, "The monitors found the buoy in the correct place and opened fire at 4:45 a.m. at a range of 26,000 yards. Practice during the winter had shown that the best way of bringing the guns quickly onto target in these conditions was to fire deliberately short at first, making it easier for the spotter plane to see the burst and give directional correction. Then the range would be steadily increased until the hits were reported. The Germans immediately replied by putting down a smokescreen, which fortunately for the British, got blown in the wrong direction by the light wind. The coastal guns then opened fire on the monitors, so it was left to the motor launches to lay a smokescreen, and this was successfully carried out. Erebus and Terror contributed some 124 rounds to the bombardment of Zeebrugge, to which Bacon had intended to follow it up immediately by one on Ostend dockyard. But this, like many other bombardments, was called off due to weather conditions. Although the dockyard in Ostend was a bigger target than the lock gates the monitors were targeting, great care had to be taken in firing due to the civilian houses near the dockyard. That meant that the monitors would have to come back for another fire, where to quote Buxton once more, "At last all was ready on the evening of June 4th, when Erebus and Terror set out, accompanied by a fleet of 22 destroyers and smoke-producing motor launches. The monitors anchored 13 miles north-northwest of Ostend in the early hours of the 5th. At 3:20 a.m., ranging shots were dropped deliberately short into the sea so that the splashes would check for direction. After 8 rounds, fire was lifted straight into the dockyard area. Aircraft spotting corrections were obtained as dawn was not too far off. Good results were reported. Enemy retaliatory fire from Deutschland and Tirpitz batteries soon began and became uncomfortably hot until the spotting balloon was shot down by a Sopwith pup. Both sides were using smoke screens. After 15 minutes, the German one obscured the target. Firing was continued using estimated corrections until 4 a.m. when the monitors weighed anchor. A good morning's work had been done. 22 hits out of 115 rounds, sinking the submarine UC-70, a dredger, and 2 barges, inflicting damage on other vessels and various buildings. The bombardment worried the Germans considerably, as an effective repeat performance would prohibit regular use of the dockyard. Neither of the 2 floating docks had been damaged, so Bacon was anxious to take advantage of any further opportunities. With that, one of the 15-inch monitors would be available over the next several months, while the others were in dock. By October, all 3 15-inch monitors were back to bombardment work. Still, both Erebus and Terror would be put out of action. The Germans had come up with some interesting ways to counter the monitors, as they had created what were essentially remote-control boats, a 6-ton boat that was 43 feet long and could reach a top speed of 30 knots. They could be steered using a 30-mile trailing cable from shore by instructions signaled by an accompanying seaplane. As they were unmanned, the intention was to crash them into the side of a monitor when it was hoped that the 700-kilogram, 1,040-pound charge would sink it. One of these came up on Erebus shortly after midday on October 28th, and was not easily repelled. Through a hail of shells from escorting vessels, FL-12, some 20 miles off Ostend, crossed under Erebus's stern and turning 180 degrees to hit her directly on the starboard bulge amidships. A huge explosion severely shook the ship, sending debris over a wide area, killing 2 and wounding 15. However, the monitor was not badly damaged, as the bulge took the main brunt of the blast. She got back safely to Dover and then was sent on around to Portsmouth for repairs. In dry dock, a 50-foot section of the outer bulge had been destroyed, but the main hull was almost undamaged. She was back in service by November 21st. Things pick up for Erebus in April of 1918 as the new German offensive in the west developed, where she and the other monitors were sent to bombard German positions again in Zeebrugge and Ostend, returning fire against the Tirpitz battery in the city. The bombardments didn't have much effect on the German positions. Later in the summer, Erebus was bombed by German aircraft while in Dunkirk on July 7th. Both bombs hit the starboard bulge. Damage was slight, but she was sent on to Portsmouth to have some repairs, where she also received 2 new 15-inch guns for the upcoming Allied land offensive. Erebus and Terror carried out a 40-minute bombardment of Zeebrugge on the 28th of September. Erebus counted 56 rounds landing near her, with some shell fragments hitting her. By the next morning, they were firing on German positions near Dunkirk, firing some 120 rounds on various targets over the next 8 hours. Very little firing was possible over the next couple of weeks. Still, on October 14th, they endeavored for one last bombardment, taking Slipe under fire, and then later that afternoon, they went again to Zeebrugge, where the Germans were busy retreating from the sector. Soon the armistice came in November, and the war for the monitors was over, awaiting their fates in Dover, where Buxton reports, "The role that Erebus and Terror had played in strengthening the Dover patrol was fully recognized. Their modern armament, reasonable speed, and generally more satisfactory design than the earlier monitors all pointed towards their being retained in peacetime, even if only for training duties. Following the war, Erebus, unlike the other World War I vintage monitors we've talked about, was not sent away to be broken up. Instead, in January 1919, she was sent to Chatham as a tender for the gunnery school, although still in full commission. Thus, when a request came in July from British forces operating around the port city of Murmansk in Russia, she was available to go to the White Sea. British forces and other Allied powers had intervened in the Russian Civil War in several places around the large nation. This meant that Erebus went right to work when she arrived on August 13th, first going to Kem in Onega, 100 miles to the southeast. Onega had been taken by the Bolsheviks some weeks earlier, and attempts to recapture it had failed. A heavy bombardment was ordered for the 28th by Erebus, M23, a smaller monitor, and HMS Narana, a seaplane tender. Anchoring some 18,000 yards from the town, Erebus used her 15-inch guns and two of her 4-inch guns, additions during the war, to bombard steamers, enemy headquarters, AA gun batteries, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations, doing a similar bombardment the following day. Nothing else of note happened in the Murmansk campaign, as it wasn't too long after the British abandoned the port city. Still, on her way back to the United Kingdom, Erebus received orders to go to Copenhagen and support the operations in the Baltic the Royal Navy was conducting. A British squadron had been sent into the Baltic in November 1918, helping the smaller nations of the Baltic resist Bolshevik pressures and ensuring that German forces in the area kept to the terms of the armistice and prevent Bolshevik naval forces from taking any offensive action. Rear Admiral Walter Cohen had been doing this with a modest force of light cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and smaller craft. He had been successful in August 1919 by blockading the naval base at Kronstadt. Cohen had previously requested monitor support, but had been rebuffed, because the monitors would apparently be of no use in the area. Again, he requested monitor support as he wanted to aid an Estonian advance towards St. Petersburg, to help destroy the Bolshevik forces barring their way. Erebus arrived in the Baltic on the 23rd. Only 4 days later, she was bombarding Bolshevik fortresses, bombarding first the Krasnaya Gorka fort in company with the cruiser Delhi and Dunedain. There was some return fire from the fortress, but nothing hit the ships. Damage to the fort was limited as some of the shells failed to explode, but it did assist in the Estonian and White Russian forces' advance. Bombardments continued for the next couple days, and unfortunately for the Estonian and White Russian forces, their attacks began to falter. To take from Buxton, by now Erebus was out of ammunition, so she was sent to Libau, on the Latvian coast, where the British were assisting the Latvians in their fight for independence against both the Bolsheviks in the east and the Germans in the south. On November 4th, the Germans had advanced right up to Libau, where British cruisers and destroyers were able to give some fire support. Erebus arrived on the 7th, ammunition from Karida and fuel from Mixel on the 8th, and was in action on the 9th. She was able to counter the German shelling of the port area over the next few days. After more reinforcements from the German Iron Division, they attacked more strongly, and on the morning of the 14th, they took part of the town. A fierce British counterattack took place with support from Erebus and the cruisers and destroyers. The range was very short, barely a mile. The ships fired over open sights using half charges. The barrage from the ships devastated the German attacks, and by the early afternoon, the Germans had been driven out of range of the guns. Erebus had fired well over 100 rounds of her 15-inch and over 400 rounds of her 4-inch ammunition that day between 5:50 a.m. and 1:40 p.m., expending nearly all of her ammunition. She remained at Libau until mid-December when the Baltic began to freeze over again, finally withdrawing with other British forces at the end of the year, returning to Chatham on the 31st of December, having covered some 7,000 miles since leaving in July. Over the coming interwar years, both Erebus and Terror were used for trial firings of their 15-inch armaments against the battleship Baden and other smaller armaments. In particular, in August 1921, Erebus badly mauled Baden with 14 shells off Isle White. So badly damaged was she that she was scuttled 6 days later. In August 1921, she was paid off into C&M at Chatham, but continued to be used as a turret drill ship there until March 1926, when she changed places with Marshal Soult at Devonport. After a refit, which saw additional accommodations and classrooms added to her decks in place of her 4-inch guns, she recommissioned in September 1926 as a combined turret drill ship, training ship for special entry cadets, amongst other duties, with a complement of 243. Her profile was a familiar one to all naval personnel because after 7 years at Devonport out in the stream, she was transferred to Portsmouth in October 1933, replacing Terror as turret drill ship and harbor training ship, another ship taking over for her other duties. She continued her work as a turret drill ship into the 1930s. During this time, the South Africans feared the possible Japanese threat and wanted heavier defenses around Cape Town. It would have been expensive to install new defenses, especially the 15-inch guns they wanted. A cheaper solution had to be found. The South Africans were not dissuaded from the idea of 15-inch guns, and after racking their brains, a solution was found. A 15-inch monitor would be loaned for the defense of Cape Town, with the South Africans paying the running cost. She would be crewed by South Africans with a nucleus of Royal Navy men to guide the ship. In 1938, steps were taken to put the plan into effect, but only as an interim measure while the fixed shore defenses were being modernized first around Cape Town and then Durban. Erebus was taken in hand at Southampton for a refit in January 1939 to get her ready for combat once again, returning to Portsmouth on the 15th of August. Her Royal Navy crew had been given South African Army uniforms, but war broke out before she could leave for South Africa. Before we take it into the Second World War, I want to go over this interesting photo from 1938, where Erebus looks a little odd. This is what she looked like as a turret drill ship from that period. The large building under her 15-inch guns was a recreation hall/gym, and the bulge was an excellent place to repair/launch the ship's boats. Anyway, getting back to the story, Erebus was scheduled to sail for South Africa on September 7th. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, postponed this and sent a telegram to General Smuts in South Africa, writing, "Monitor Erebus is ready to sail for Cape Town. As you know, we have never considered 15-inch guns necessary for the defense of Cape Town. We realize the defenses of Cape Town remain weak. Still, the Germans have no battleships, and the only 2 battlecruisers they possess, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, would be very unlikely to try to reach South African waters, or if they did so to risk damage far from a friendly dockyard from even weak defenses. Should they break out, a major naval operation would ensue, and we shall pursue them wherever they go with our most powerful vessels until they are hunted down. Therefore, it seems to me you are unlikely to need this ship. On the other hand, she would be most useful for various purposes in the shallows of the Belgian coast, especially if Holland were attacked. She was indeed built by Fisher and me for this very purpose in 1914. The question is therefore mainly political. Rather than do anything to embarrass you, we would rather do without the ship. But if you can let us have her either by reloan or retransfer, Admiralty will be most grateful and would of course reimburse the Union. All good wishes." Smuts readily agreed to Churchill's request, so Erebus remained with the Royal Navy. Also, I hope Churchill doesn't start a fire in the comments over what he called Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Erebus remained in Portsmouth for the next 5 months for gunnery instruction and occasional trial firings. She returned to Thornycroft's at Southampton on February 17th for a refit, during which time her anti-aircraft armament and deck protection were considerably strengthened. Buxton details in his section about the modifications. The armor was fitted at Erebus's 1940 refit when the upper deck was plated up at the sides for good. 3 single 4-inch high-angle/low angle were fitted on each side of the forecastle deck as in Terror, with associated high-angle calculating positions, HACP, port, and starboard. 4 quadruple half-inch guns were also fitted, 2 mountings forward and 2 aft. In addition, a brand new AA weapon favored by Churchill was provided, the rocket launcher. 2 20-barrel unrotated projectile UP mountings were fitted on a platform abaft the funnel, capable of firing a cloud of 7-inch parachute and cable projectiles into the path of an attacking dive bomber. Each rocket released a parachute carrying a small aerial mine on a cable intended to catch the aircraft's wing and explode. A normal 3-inch rocket mortar was used, filled out to a 7-inch diameter by the mine canister. Other modifications included the removal of the topmast, fitting of degaussing cables on the hull externally, and provision of Carly life rafts in their launching skids, but radar was not yet fitted. All these changes considerably increased her deep displacement to 9,100 tons, with serious effects on her handling. A substantially increased crew was required to operate all the extra equipment, her authorized wartime complement being raised to 308. The usual wartime disruptive camouflage scheme was adopted, which did not include the display of the ship's pendant number, apart from the small monitors showing their M numbers. 11 further improvements were made to Erebus's armament throughout the war. She recommissioned on July 10th, by which time the Germans had overrun the Low Countries and France. Churchill, now Prime Minister, was anxious to see her return to her World War I form and bombard German positions on the continent, even visiting her with Lord Beaverbrook on the 17th. The crew was inexperienced, and therefore the ships needed an extended working up. Because of the fear of German bombing raids on the southern coast of the United Kingdom, she moved to Scapa Flow to work up, arriving there on August 12th. Due to some issues with her not steaming at any serious speed in 20 years and some full-caliber bombardments for practice, she headed south again in late September. The passage south on the 25th without escort was uneventful until she reached Lowestoft when she was attacked by E-boats. The 4 torpedoes the Germans fired at Erebus just passed a few yards ahead of her bows, as the Germans were probably thinking she was doing more than her stately 9 knots on account of her large wash from the bulge. Eventually, Erebus made it south where Vice Admiral Ramsay, Commander-in-Chief at Dover, had planned that Erebus should make her first targets the barges that were gathering at Calais for the projected invasion of Britain. Erebus set out on the 28th, where she was attacked by a single German aircraft in the Thames estuary, with 4 bombs falling just ahead of her. Her voyage down the narrow-swept channel proved difficult owing to her lack of maneuverability in the prevailing weather conditions, so she abandoned her attack, where Crosley writes, "The next day, with the help of a tug, she made it to the buoy which was laid to mark her firing position, sighted 8 miles east of South Goodwin Lightship, dropped anchor, and began to bombard Calais docks. But after a few rounds, trouble with the gun turrets, and the absence of reports from the Swordfish aircraft which were supposed to be spotting the fall of shot, forced her to stop. Further operations were delayed until the middle of October due to poor weather and freshly laid minefields. Still, on the 16th, she opened up accurate fire at a range of 25,000 yards, a little over 14 statute miles, on Dunkirk docks. Oddly enough, she was accompanied on this occasion by the same tug, Lady Brassey, whom she had worked with 25 years earlier. There were no large enemy ships at Dunkirk at that time, so no serious damage was done. It was now fully apparent that she was nowhere near as effective as a bombarding unit as she had been in World War I. Apart from the severe operational limitations engendered by the presence of enemy aircraft, her general mechanical performance and condition had deteriorated significantly, not to mention her lack of radar. Returning to Chatham from an overhaul, she returned to service by Christmas with a new large rudder and sporting additional AA weapons, including rocket projectors. She spent the early months of 1941 as part of the AA defenses against mine-laying aircraft, and even participated in a bombardment of the U-boat pens in Ostend in mid-February, scoring 6 hits on the pens, where taking from Buxton once more. Orders for her to sail to the eastern Mediterranean came in mid-September, as she was urgently required to support the forthcoming British offensive against the Germans under General Rommel in Cyrenaica. Tara having served so well in this role earlier in the year, but she had yet to attain her full complement of 400, as well as her outfit of the newly available 20mm Oerlikons. The small convoy sailed on December 1st, consisting of Erebus, Roberts, the sloop Scarborough, and the corvette Fritillary. By the time she reached South Africa, Japan had entered the war and was striking a series of devastating blows at British possessions in the Far East. It was therefore decided to divert her to strengthen the British defenses in the Indian Ocean, so she sailed from Durban on the 31st of January 1942 for Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. After the longest voyage the Monitor had ever made, the ship's company was disconcerted to be greeted on arrival at Colombo by the Chief of Staff remarking, "Erebus? Erebus? Not the old Erebus. What have you come here for?" While they did call the ship Cerberus the home for old salts, they did feel that she could contribute usefully to the protection of the lightly defended Ceylon. She arrived at Trincomalee on March 2nd, 1942, to take up guardship duties. In early April, a powerful Japanese fleet, the Kido Butai, in their Indian Ocean raid, struck Trincomalee with their aircraft on the 9th of April at about 7:30 a.m., Erebus opened fire immediately, but considerable damage was done to the shore installations, while Erebus suffered some casualties from 6 near misses on the port side. As a result of the Japanese attack on Ceylon, the British Eastern Fleet was withdrawn to East Africa. Erebus's next several months weren't very interesting until September 10th, when she assisted in the British landings on Madagascar, but she did little in the way of bombardment. She spent the next 6 weeks as a guard ship in Madagascar. After those 6 weeks, she sailed for Durban, South Africa, getting some new crew and acting as a turret drill ship once again. Taking classes on board for sea firing trials, she also had her aging boilers retubed. There was such a shortage for dock space, she shared her dock with the battleship Valiant for a week. Anyway, she left Durban on April 9th, 1943, for the forthcoming assault on southern Europe from North Africa. After a stop on the East African coast, she attempted to navigate the Suez Canal on May 27th without tugs. Rather poor move from her captain, as it turned out. With her poor maneuverability, she ended up touching either side of the canal and damaged her rudder. Eventually, 2 tugs came to assist the hapless Erebus, eventually arriving at Alexandria on June 1st, where she went to the dock for repairs. Such was the need for this floating dock, Erebus would be moved in and out 3 times for more pressing repairs. Eventually, she was allocated to support the Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, along with the newer monitors Erebus and Abercrombie. On July 3rd, she left with convoy MWS.36, where Erebus was to cover the northernmost landings at Acid North, or about 15 miles north of Cape Passero. Buxton describes Erebus's opening days with her bombardment missions. Erebus had been ready to support an airborne brigade at her bombardment position about 10 miles southeast of Syracuse since 7 a.m. on D-Day, but her first call for fire did not come until 2:15 p.m. With 12 rounds, she destroyed a strong point east of Ponte Grande. Shortly afterwards, shipping in the Acid sector was subjected to heavy air attacks by Ju-88s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Erebus suffered 8 near misses, but without incurring any damage, so was able to respond to a call for fire on another strongpoint at about 8 p.m. 8 rounds from 19,000 yards sufficed to destroy it. Owing to the speed of the advance and the ineffectual coastal defenses, she received no calls for fire on D+1, but spent D+2 in almost continuous bombardment. At 5:40 a.m., she began firing at a coastal defense battery near Augusta. This and other batteries received attention during the morning in 7 separate shoots to cover the advance on the important naval base of Augusta, which would permit the entry of Allied ships. The first attempts by destroyers failed, but Erebus and assistance from other ships proved successful, expending a lot of their ammunition complement. Erebus then moved north for bombardments of the strongly defended Catania region. Catania airfield was taken under fire from maximum range, and other bombardments were made in company with the cruisers involved in the bombardment duties. Axis air attacks occurred throughout this period, as the Allied air cover wasn't perfect. Smoke screens were used to help cover the ships as they bombarded their positions. Roberts eventually took over on the 14th, as Erebus had to retire to Malta to replenish her ammunition, and returned on the 18th of July, where she and Roberts were there to support the advances on the eastern coast of Sicily. Nightly bombing raids and torpedo raids were frequent over the area, often necessitating several hundred rounds of AA ammunition to be expended each night. On the night of the 20th, Erebus was straddled by 2 bombs, killing 6 and wounding 26. The following morning, she put 16 rounds in the Catania area, with shore batteries returning fire ineffectually. She next bombarded Taormino on the 14th of August, which was pretty much the end of her bombardment duties for the Sicilian campaign, returning to Malta on the 21st for replenishment. With the Germans driven out of Sicily, the Allies planned for the invasion of mainland Italy. With that, the 3 remaining British monitors were needed, leaving on August 30th to support these operations. The first operation for Erebus started on September 3rd, supporting the invasion of Reggio at the tip of the Italian boot, expending only 10 rounds as the landing was practically uncontested. The next morning, the other monitors left to help in operations around Salerno. Erebus continued to operate around the southern tip of Italy until the 10th of September, when she returned to Malta. After this, she sailed for the United Kingdom on the 18th for an extensive 4-month refit, where Crosley describes her refit with this. Erebus emerged from Devonport and laden with a new topmast, a mizzen and air warning radars, as well as enhanced anti-aircraft armament in the form of 4 twin 20mm Mark V quick-firing guns for close air defense. She now had no less than 5 radar sets. All this technology in the crews, generators, and stores to go with it increased her draft so much that the bulges were completely underwater. And with only 5 feet of freeboard, her decks became extremely wet even in moderate weather. Always difficult to handle, she was now a regular pig to steer, and her best speed was reduced to 15 knots. All of this refitting was done on February 10th, where she spent the next several months working up to assist in the upcoming invasion of northern France. Because Buxton does such a great job describing the Monitor's actions, he writes, Erebus departed Greenock at midnight on May 24th to take her place in Bombarding Force A of the Western Task Force, which was to cover the 2 American landings on the Normandy beaches. After brief stops in Belfast Lock and Tow Bay, she anchored off Weymouth on the 28th. She sailed at 4:30 on June 5th, taking station astern of convoy UA.1, part of the force destined for Utah Beach, escorted by the U.S. destroyer Garrity. After an uneventful passage through the swept channels, she dropped anchor 12 miles northeast of Utah Beach at 4:20 a.m. on the 6th, ready to fire on any German coastal batteries that showed signs of interfering with the landings. Allied Air Force bombers had already attacked the batteries, while the other ships of the bombarding fleet carried out neutralizing bombardments from their positions close inshore from 5:50 to H-hour at 6:30. Erebus's first bombardments took place 5 minutes after H-hour, with 4 rounds at a battery north of the beaches. Unfortunately, the blast broke the port anchor cable. It was over an hour before she next opened fire with 26 rounds at Pernalay Battery with its 3 170mm 6.7-inch on the northeast corner of the Cherbourg Peninsula. During the morning of D-Day, she remained on patrol with the U.S. battleship Nevada and the cruiser Black Prince, USS Tuscaloosa, and USS Quincy, ready to open fire on any targets requested by the shore fire control parties. 10 rounds were fired at St. Marcouf Battery in the early afternoon, Erebus scoring a direct hit on number 2 gun. By the end of the day, all 3 of its 210mm 8.3-inch Skoda guns had been knocked out by naval and air bombardment. At about 4:40 p.m., Erebus received a request to fire on a radar station controlling the fire of the shore batteries. Just after her left gun fired, the Royal Marine officer commanding the turret felt a thud followed by another. On looking out his vision slit, he saw splashes in the water ahead and reported to the bridge that the turret had been hit. When he went into the gunhouse proper, he found the gun's crew reeling about. The left gun in at near maximum elevation and a strong smell of cordite. He then realized that the projectile in the left gun had exploded as it passed up the barrel, bursting off the jacket, splitting the gun open, and distorting the cradle and trunnion supports. The breach had held, so there was no serious casualties, but the turret was unfit for further use owing to the ruptured hydraulic piping. Closer examination showed that the repair of the mounting would be a major dockyard job. Still, the immediate fears were of the charge and its projectile loaded in the right gun cooking off, and the remains of the left gun breaking off and dropping through the forecastle deck. Fortunately, neither happened, although Erebus had to remain at anchor off Utah Beach for 2 days while arrangements were made for her return passage and repair. After some shuffling around to various areas, repairs were conducted. She eventually departed on the 22nd of July for the Normandy beaches again, where the only place she could provide naval gunfire support was on the eastern flank of the invasion, where the German batteries between the rivers Orne and Seine harassed Allied shipping in the area. Although there were several other ships in the area to support with their guns, Erebus's guns were there for the longest range gunfire and the well-protected coast defenses. Between July 25th and August 14th, she fired some 150 rounds at these targets, generally while at anchor 3 miles from shore, where various measures were put in place to counter any German attempts to assault the ship while she anchored. As the Allies advanced throughout August, they soon moved out of range of her guns, and no more targets remained within the range of the Normandy coastline. Although the port city of Le Havre, where German soldiers held out, with Hitler declaring the port city of Festung a town to be held at all cost, which was heavily defended seaward by a variety of eclectic guns ranging from 75mm to 170mm guns, where Erebus was to cover the advance of the 1st Corps with her artillery, opening fire on the 5th of September at 11:32 a.m. Just 20 minutes later, she was struck by a shell forward of the turret on the port bulge, assuming a list of 3 degrees. The shell was from the 170mm battery. Erebus moved out of range and onto Portsmouth for repairs. She was patched up and returned on the 8th, firing some 10 rounds before she was struck again by that battery, which did not explode in the ship, only causing a hole. So she carried on firing for the next several days until the 11th, in company with the battleship Warspite. The following day, after she returned to Portsmouth for repairs, the city surrendered. Erebus was ordered to Dover in early October in company with Roberts to support operations against the Belgian and Dutch coast, a place she knew all too well from the war that some of her crew weren't even alive to see. The two ships provided bombardment support on the first against the island of Walcheren, which I discussed in my video on Roberts. Still, with the war coming to a close, Erebus's service was also coming to a close, where Buxton closes out his section on Erebus by writing, "After 5 years' arduous war service, Erebus was in no condition to join her two more modern sisters allocated to the East Indies Fleet to continue the war against Japan. She was, therefore, sent round to the Nore, arriving on July 3rd, 1945, where she became a turret drill ship at Chatham again, after a lapse of 19 years, also providing accommodation for stokers mechanics under training. She was approved to scrap a year later, so left Chatham under tow for Rosyth on July 13th, 1946, where her gun barrels were removed. She made her final 4-mile voyage towards Inverkeithing Yard for breaking up on January 29th, 1947. Erebus was certainly a very interesting ship, and probably my favorite monitor to research and write thus far. Anyway, thanks for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Remember to have a great week, everyone.